We have been subject to change rather than agents of change. My point has been always to couple science and innovation policy the same way to these public values. This is not untypical when it comes to Europe or to actually the global situation. We only start to change things when we hit a disaster. So the question is then, how will these technologies be shaped? What form will they take? How can RRI actually ever address this thing?
Hi there, and welcome to Future Up Close. Here we explore the topic of responsible innovation. Today we have Dr. René von Schomberg, who is based in Brussels, in Belgium. René is a philosopher and a STS scholar, that's a science, technology, and society scholar. He graduated as an agricultural scientist at Wageningen University in the Netherlands and completed his second PhD specializing in philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. René joined the European Commission in 1998, where he is currently serving as a team leader for science policy, which oversees, for example, research and innovation, governance and ethics of emerging technologies such as nanotechnology and ICT, and the promotion of international dialogue on ethically sensitive issues, including privacy and data protection. He is a guest professor at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany and is also the author and editor of 15 books, with the latest called the International Handbook on Responsible Innovation, a Global Resource. So for the next hour or so, we will be discussing key trends regarding innovation policies worldwide and what these changes may mean for business leaders, entrepreneurs, and investors to help you make more informed innovation decisions. So, welcome to the show, Renee.
I'm pleased to be here.
You've been involved in responsible innovation from the very beginning. In fact, a number of your colleagues have said that you've made significant contribution to the responsible innovation movement. What got you interested in responsible innovation in the first place?
This goes back, I think, till my time as a student. I was always interested in the science-society relationship, especially how society could help to shape technological change. I was, like many other scholars in the STS field, always concerned about the risk of new technologies. But this then moved on to a whole bunch of topics. One of them is what I call decision making under scientific uncertainty. So how do you make as a society reasonable decisions against the background of scientific controversies and societal controversies? This is up till today an important topic if you look to climate change or all the big ecological issues. And then secondly, I want to see how we can drive innovations towards social desirable ends. And then this short sentence, driving innovation towards social desirable ends, raises enormous amount of questions. First, of course, how can you define social desirable ends? Who decides on them? How innovation can be managed towards these social desirable ends? And the problems of relationships between science and innovation. So the whole institutional arrangement, which is now my key interest, on how to change the conditions under which science is performed, as well as the public governance of the economy, who have to undergo a major change in order to help achieve this key sentence, how to drive innovations towards social desirable ends. And of course, I think up till today, it remains striking that when it comes to societal change, most changes recently have been induced by new technologies. We have been subject to change rather than agents of change. as individuals, or as societies as well. We have not called for the internet, although we enjoyed it. We did not call for genetically modified organisms. We never demanded these things, and yet they determine our lives. So it's an enormous challenge to say, how can we have a more human-centered technology, which is designed and wanted by us all.
So what does responsible innovation symbolize for you then? Is it a more sense of empowerment for humans to drive their future?
Yes, exactly. So it would be an empowerment of citizens and societies to first help to shape these innovations, and to the extent possible determine their characteristics. Of course, this is a sort of ideal. I'm of course aware that one will never ever achieve a technology from which you completely determine its characteristics, far ahead of time. It requires monitoring of technologies. It requires engagement. So, and it is therefore also coupled to a democratization process, which was, this goes actually back to the 1960s. We have established in Western societies uh, democracies, but democracy has not entered into the issue of technologies. I mean, we have only been addressing those things in terms of constraints. What technologies are not allowed to do, or what we should not allow on the market. What I call an ethics of constraints. But we don't have a constructive ethics, which in my terms is translated in a collective co-responsibility for the design of new innovations.
Can you share with us what are the key initiatives you are currently working on to drive responsible innovation?
The last few years, I've been working on, in my capacity at the European Commission, trying to motivate and to engage stakeholders in a process to change the reward and incentive system for researchers. So that means we currently have a research system, like you also have very strongly in Australia, which pushes researchers to a productivity in terms of publishing as much as possible, and then preferably in high impact journals. This leads actually to a particular paradox. We can show that the more people actually publish, the less productive the system becomes in terms of addressing societal relevant issues. And this is because the journals researchers preferably want to publish because they will get their prestige on that. Select articles on of course scientific interest, but not necessarily whether it helps to contribute to social desirable ends. So we try to change this rewards and incentive system to a system where researchers are not rewarded only for the amount of publications they do, for example, or where they publish, but whether they collaborate and whether they share their data and knowledge early on in order to address societal challenges. And I think COVID was actually a gift for our research, for this motive, because with COVID, it became immediately clear that we would never achieve a vaccine if scientists would not collaborate very early on, forget about their publication, share their data immediately. And this is what happened to a large extent, which contributed to the early availability of a vaccine. But of course, the question remains, for all these important global societal challenges, we have to rearrange our rewards system globally, actually, for scientists, and motivate them and reward them for collaborating early on, as we did with COVID. This is only one element, of course, from ROI. You can say it's a sort of precondition for achieving ROI. ROI is much broader than this element of institutionalizing open science within the research system. But this is already a very big task, and stakeholders are, of course, at least reluctantly to move in this direction. But we have had some major initiatives recently. So I can quote, for example, the Netherlands or also in Finland, where they changed the system already to an extent that they abandoned the general impact factor, for example, as a reward criterion. They, in fact, in Netherlands abandoned all forms of quantitative metrics as a way of judging scientific achievements within research units. And open science and open collaboration has become an element for rewarding them as well. At the European level, we try now to get also in other countries changes, maybe not in an identical way as in the Netherlands. Every country may have its own way of doing these things, but that there will be a common ground for changing the rewards and incentive system in such a way that research behavior becomes rewardable, not just research outputs. And when it comes to research output, there's also a very much broader set of research outputs will become rewardable, not only publications, but for example, also open data sets or software or cell lines, you name it.
Are all the tools required to make open science easier already available? Or are there any extra additional help that would make open science or open collaboration easier?
That's a good point, of course. You can say that open science, in the sense as I just mentioned it, so in terms of open collaboration and early knowledge and data sharing, that this has been driven by bottom up, also by digital means. We have now a lot of open or semi-open digital platforms in which researchers can share presentations or preprints or documents very early on. And this has, I think, since the beginning of the last decade, risen exponentially. This sharing has taken place, despite that this sharing was not rewarded as such by the system. There's a growing sense in the scientific community, and of course also motivated by scientists themselves, in the sense that they want to have their material read. Of course, if you write an article, you want to be read, and interesting enough, if you publish on an open digital platform, there are more people who read your article than when you publish in Nature. so, so, so in that sense, it's an incentive as well. So this is a bottom-up reaction, but we found, let's say around 2013-14, as a diagnosis that this bottom-up change which is happening needs support from public governance.
So the core of responsible innovation is finding common values and then a vision for the future, and then directing our innovations towards, give it a direction, right? However, one of the consequences of globalization is that our values are changing. And I think, especially for the younger generation, some might even say that their values, or they can relate to people who are in a different country more than, say, their family or their neighbor. So my question then is, what does this mean for developing innovation policies? In particular, how do we ensure that the direction we give our innovations remain relevant for the local population whose values and interests are diversifying?
Yes, this is an important question. So this raises actually a couple of issues. So one issue you raised yourself, which public values are so universal enough to carry, for instance, global changes, and which are predominantly on local levels and regional levels because of a huge variety in cultural attitudes around the world. It's actually interesting to notice that in the European Union, for example, also from an external viewer from Australia, that we always argue enormously with each other among member states about almost anything. And certainly, if you would say, let's argue about values, then they would say, this is really not an issue for the European Union to tackle. This is something for local and member state level. But you will be surprised that we have established, over decades of social evolvement, so to speak, a common set of shared public European values, which are very strongly shared and which are unfortunately decoupled from science and technology and innovation policy. These values, they drive a lot of public policies across different nations and cultures. Uh, when it comes, for instance, for environmental policy or even trade policy, we share a lot of values would drive these policies, but not science and innovation. Science and innovation has always been seen as a goal in itself. Uh, and predominantly justified in macroeconomic terms like any innovation is good because it produces economic benefit for all. Now, so my point has been always to couple science and innovation policy the same way to these public values, minimally in Europe, then of course, as with these other policies. And this would then subsequently mean that when it comes to implementation of particular technologies, and then the local aspect comes in, because the situation in every country is not the same. To the Sustainable Development Goals equally also evolved over many decades of international dialogue and cooperation. We share that from almost virtual every corner of Earth that these issues are enormously important. We all agree that we want to achieve them. We all agree that they should be at the core of science and technology work. All these things we actually agree on. Only we may disagree on how to achieve them and what it means locally. And this is where the translation comes in. So, and this is also important for responsible research and innovation because first you have, of course, to establish that this innovation is based on these shared public values, but then subsequently what climate change means in Sri Lanka or means in the Netherlands is different. And 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise is maybe harmless for one part of the Earth, but a catastrophe somewhere else. I would say it's not then a difference of values; it's more an articulation on what it then means for your community to work on. And this then is, of course, part of the RRI process, and this is why citizens' involvement and co-creation and co-design is enormous important for RRI because this is the means to mediate these universal or pretty universal public values, translating them into local situations. But of course, the most important thing is that our policies should support these public values in science and technology policy, and this has not been sufficient the case in the last few years. So we see now at the European level some changes towards that. We have established mechanisms for trying to achieve major societal objectives. What we now call mission-oriented research, and these missions are different than maybe research missions from the past, because these missions are targeted at social objectives, and they are not aimed at increasing our technological capacity to the maximum or exploiting technologies to the maximum, but they are aimed at achieving social ends, which is of course an RRI objective.
What you said about prioritizing the social aspect of innovation, that seems to be quite opposite to the commercial players who are obviously much more focused on profits from innovation. How is that tension managed? I remember you did say that the goal is to develop a system where individual companies don't really have to think about whether they are doing responsible innovation because the system's designed in a way that would encourage that anyway. But how do you manage?
Well, yeah, that's correct. I mean, of course, if you are an individual company or an innovator, it's of course natural that you look to opportunities which is of course profit driven, which would also not change when we have RRI institutionalized. But the difference is, of course, that the markets, the functioning of the markets, which is not the responsibility of these individual companies, but it's the responsibility of the states to manage these markets, have to be improved in terms of addressing market deficits. My biggest examples are always in the pharmaceutical or in agricultural areas, because these are areas which are dominated by a few big companies which have narrowed down the scope of innovations to a limited set of innovations which will drive the profits, of course. But unfortunately, this means the major challenges on Earth, like be it from malaria, which is the disease which affects most people on Earth, or be it even antibiotics, which are increasingly become less ineffective, that these areas are not addressed hardly at all by these big companies because there are no interest in it. And then again, with COVID, it's the same. They would not have invested in, they actually would not even consider to invest in developing a vaccine. And up till now, they did not do that actually because they were subsidized to do it. So you can see there's an enormous market deficit in driving innovations towards evident public challenges. So what we have to do about this, I think there are a couple of changes. The first thing is that public authorities have retreated too much from the market, so they have left things too much to the market. That means that we have to think of another public governance of the economy, which especially in the area of sustainable development goals, where you have to make certain transitions towards new technologies. Let's take the Green Deal in Europe. Again, this can be addressed by the markets, but markets will only respond to that when the conditions are there. So on that front, there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's increasing awareness that also legal actions has to be taken by the states when you want to address, for example, climate change. So these things. So the whole public governance of the economy has to become a new target for action. And there are some instruments in which we can achieve these things. So one instrument is, which is practiced to some extent, particular public-private partnerships, to focus on these market deficits, for example, in order to ensure that we do research on malaria, for example, that we will work on those things. And of course, again, the backing up by the scientific system that these topics will be rewardable for research. And then there is maybe a new dimension to it that that companies themselves, who of course normally see themselves as competitors, in some cases, when the public authorities come in, can make them also work together. They not necessarily need always or only compete with each other, but also collaborate with each other. That they can share resources and so on. But that means you have as a public authority to task to enable these processes. And that it makes also sense for these companies to do that, although it may be from a rational point of view very logical to share resources when it comes to, for instance, addressing COVID among companies, but they will not do it if there is no incentive or there is no structure for enabling them to do that.
When you say incentives, can you give some examples?
Well, I mean, institutional arrangements is one thing. So, but on the other thing is the development of innovation standards, for example, to which companies could comply with. This is now we did some work at Europe within some projects on setting new standards. And one example I have in my handbook is on agricultural is on precision technology in agriculture, where you as a public authority can intervene in these technologies by setting important framework conditions. For example, whether data which are collected by these precision technologies by farmers, that these data are owned by the farmers themselves and not centralized by big companies, for example. If you allow sharing of data among farmers, for example, then they can work together. Then they would not need at that front to compete with each other. They can learn from each other, share data, sell their products maybe without using the retailers directly on the market to the customers online. But if you centralize it in big companies like the company there in the US, for example, who make tractors and who probably have more data about the land of farmers than the farmers know themselves, then you can get an agricultural system which is very much global market driven and which will drive to more commodity produce, bigger, even larger landscape, larger agricultural farms than we already have now. And this can lead to a pulverization of agricultural produce. Now, so the design of such a system, so it's actually on a sort of system level where the public governance comes in. You have to look to the agricultural system and say, okay, what do we want to get out of this system? Or do you want to have a completely global market-driven system, which inevitably, as things go now, for example, would lead to a situation of strong focus on commodity production. So this is these things. So this is why the role of public governments and with instruments like public-private partnerships or incentives for farmers to work together would actually help. Of course, in every sector, you might have you might need other approaches, but in all these cases, it is important to have maybe also a foresight system in place, which allows governments to foresee the possible scenarios, what will happen in 10, 20 years if we leave things as they are now. It's enormously much more complicated to change things if things have dramatically go wrong than if you can have an ability to change during the time. So it's about managing a transition process either to sustainable farming or to sustainable energy. All this requires transition processes which needs strong public governance.
So the impact of technology is dependent, of course, on the technology itself, but also how people use the technology, especially if it's a consumer product. Does this mean that alongside innovation policies, in terms of how innovations should be developed, there should also be policies around education, educating the public, marketing restrictions and guidelines, those kind of things to ensure that the people who are receiving the innovation know what they are getting themselves into? Is that part of the scope of responsible innovation policies as well? Or is that more of a collaboration with other departments, areas?
No, I would say that is part of it, but already in your wording you say people receiving innovation. So if I quote you there, uh, this is precisely the problem. So within education and within involvement of citizens in innovation, it's about not just that you receive the innovation, but that you are actively part of it. So this is, of course, practiced in technologies which are, let's say, the most flexible ones, especially in the ICT sector, where it's more easier to involve end users and citizens in designing what they actually want to get out of innovations. So yeah, that's in a sense again a sort of democratization, but also making it concrete that you get technologies people actually want. Of course, companies also are aware of that. They don't. They also see the business advantage if something is really carried by the public. Then of course you will also have more success on the market. So which is fine, but so the idea, the interesting thing also, if you engage with citizens in the innovation process itself, which is always a very unpredictable element, and users actually use technologies very often in a way which was also not foreseen by the companies itself. Microsoft, I think, introduced some type of game. When they introduced them as video games, they thought this was it, but then there were doctors using it for optimizing their heart surgery and things like that. So and then of course the company realizes that and started to adjust the elements of this technology towards that goal as well. But you could also say if you would have involved users early on in the process, then you can identify these possible uses or reuse of technology for other objectives and so on. And so user involvement is a way of addressing it, but it can also address particular implementation of on the ethics which we had before. I mean, for example, I mean, we may agree on relative universal values concerning personal data protection, for example, but its interpretation or implementation in particular context can cause huge varieties in opinions among people, and so also in that sense, the participation of immediate participation in the design of new software, for example, is quite interesting to follow up, and it certainly would contribute to an ROI perspective.
It seems like out of the 4 responsible innovation pillars, the responsiveness element seems to be the hardest for companies to do. I'm just wondering, would you have any tips?
The responsiveness first has to be something which is also institutionalized, and there again the public governance is important, that actors can become responsive. So it's not that that people don't want to be responsive, but they should be enabled and should be part. So the public authority, in other words, should allocate also tasks, to people, what type of responsiveness is actually required. This has to be done at different levels. So in terms of research, for example, where you can say, well, stakeholder participation is important, but you can also have a particular commitment towards a goal, so that this can be institutionalized, and then this responsiveness is then already incentivized, and people will be able to do that within that context. Um, the same is with anticipation. I mean, anticipation for a big part is something which is actually also the responsibility of the state, um, less actually the companies themselves. But of course, also the bigger companies, for example, when it comes to the sustainability of their organization, they need to have a long-term view. In some cases, this can go pretty far. A big chemical giant in the Netherlands, for example, in AXO, they actually abandoned this program again, but they started to subsidize education projects in the slums of South Africa, just by the argument that these people will be their customers later on in 20 years. So it sounds like it's not, you would say, well, this is for a company very strange to do. But the CEO at that time found this is an important initiative. Now, these things can also only be done if you have cooperation of the state. So in that case, also there was cooperation with the South African government. Anticipation can go, especially by the bigger companies, say should actually be part of their program if they want to have a long-term sustainability goal. And if we now already know that by 2050 the fossil energy is over, at least this is the objective in many countries already by now. Some of all even want to go faster. Then they have to think on where they are beyond 2050. So it is the anticipation is of course is important, and I think they can only shape their future also in relation to not just their current customers, but much broader in the whole societal context.
I'm going to refer to a particular chapter in your book. So in chapter 8, which is called "Is Innovation Always Good for You?" by Luc Veuter. Is that right, Veuter?
Luc Veuter is the author of the article, yes.
Yeah. So Luc said, responsive innovation should best start with companies and innovators, but these characters are often not aware of the long-term impact of their innovations. And he gave example, the financial innovation of credit swaps that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. So my question here is there anything we can learn from, for example, the financial crisis from a policy perspective in preventing a similar crisis in AI, biotech, even social media, which are innovations, of course, that are much closer and much more intimate to humans, which means that they're more risky?
Well, yeah, that's I'm not sure if I can answer this question satisfactorily in terms of the parallel to the financial crisis to which Luc Veuter referred to. Insofar there is a comparison, you can say that financial markets were pretty much unregulated. And prior to the economic crisis, there were already demands by some governments even to have a better regulation of these global financial markets. And this was never achieved because there was a strong resistance against that. And even post-crisis, particular changes in the banking sector, for example, has happened globally, also in Europe very strongly with regulations. There has been ongoing discussion on particular taxing on financial transactions and so on. So it has led to some changes, and this is not untypical when it comes to Europe or to actually the global situations. We only start to change things when we hit a disaster, So we had a financial disaster, so it came to a sudden response. And now with COVID, although we know already open science is a good thing to do before COVID, but now it helps. So again, you have this situation. But what we did not do yet, and this is of course then the parallel probably, is that on a global level, when it comes, for instance, for AI, as you has now mentioned, as probably the new technology which now has receives a lot of focus, that precisely this technology might be driven completely by, let's say, the competition between global operators such as Alibaba in China and Google and Microsoft on the other side in the US. So you will have an intense competition between big companies, very few big companies, who invest enormously in these technologies. I believe they invest to 1 billion a year in AI. This is much more than governments can give follow up to. So the question is then, how will these technologies be shaped? What form will they take? How can RRI actually ever address this thing? So yeah, and then I just have to repeat myself a little bit. I mean, the public governments again will become enormously important, and and the European Commission does also fund AI, and they want to even fund what they call then good AI. So AI was this centered to and let's say enhance human autonomy, or has all kinds of nice ethical objectives. But the question is if the technology itself are designed as a consequence of this huge competition, whether we can achieve our goal here. So this is a normal challenge, and so the parallel with the financial crisis is only that of what type of regulation you want to take in place, and what type of governance you want to take in place, and certainly the financial crisis was the consequences of a lack of governance. And under the Trump regime, so to speak, the international governance even went further backwards. So international governance, global cooperation are things which are prerequisites for RRI in a global perspective. And but the last decade we have engaged in dismantling global governance. Even institutions like the WHO, which are now important in the context of COVID, have suffered of lack of global governance instead of getting the support needed. So this is the biggest challenge, I think. And one can get pessimistic there, but maybe at one point there will also be a new wave of politicians which reflect the urgency of these things. And
do you think that realistically is another disaster?
Well, I mean,
Not,
one can one maybe cannot imagine yet what will be the disaster of AI in the future. I on the short term, I only see maybe the application of AI in relatively pointless areas. Maybe an AI which automatically likes say Facebook pages in your name or something like that. So which these are the type of innovations we normally get. On the other hand, of course, you have very problematic applications of AI in which the intransparency of the algorithms used lead to decision making, which is catastrophic. So we have the example already from the US where companies have developed algorithms to help to decide whether prisoners can go on early release or not. But the algorithms are privatized and you don't know on what basis these decisions are made. So that again is of course an issue of public governance. One either should not privatize these things or not, or if they are privatized, then the algorithms should be transparent. These are also of course challenges on I think on the immediately short term. Responsible innovation as a paradigm requires a shift from, let's say, on one hand, we have still the traditional key tech orientation, be it biotech, AI, or nano, in the hope that this will bring us the economic benefits, or in which we engage also on the basis of competition between blocks, where there is an intense competition to try to be the best in this area. But this contradicts with RI as an new innovation paradigm, where you want to achieve social desirable goals, and where the governance is actually where the assessment and of your success is different. So in the competition model, you look, of course, to a competitive advantage as a sort of governance success, where in RRI you look to achieving social desirability as a success. And the latter requires more than only technological innovation.
Even governance is maybe the most important thing to ensure responsible innovation happens in the future. How do we ensure that the instruments we put in themselves are responsible and driving the right behaviors?
Well, yeah, that's of course also an important element. Anything you will do in terms of public governance in this area has to be a result of a democratic process, of course. This is where we started also off with. We actually see that science and technology has been an area in Western society which still can be much more democratized than it currently is in terms of its steering and governance. So how we would introduce RRI within a deliberative democracy is in itself a social political theme. This has been a subject matter which a lot of people actually have also worked on, and there have been in the past all kinds of experiments, of course, with extending deliberative democracy to science and technology. We had in the 90s these so-called consensus conferences on all kinds of new technologies, be it genetic modification or issues such as that. But we have now reached a state where we have to implement this much more institutionally. So within universities, within organizations. So, and I think there we also made some progress. So some universities, for example, have profiled themselves as universities who want to contribute to notably sustainable development actions, change the organization of their university to optimize contributions in this direction. So I think it's indeed an issue of deliberative democracy, where we have to continuously discuss these things. I think you also mentioned in one of your questions, people can, or maybe people don't change their values very quickly, but the application of, or let's say the application of values in particular contexts can change. Our notions about privacy have of course also changed over the last 100 years. When X-ray was discovered, when somebody would make an X-ray of my body, you would not show this picture to somebody where you see the skeleton. It would be an intrusion of privacy in the past. Now nobody would sense it. This is relevant. Nobody would care. But it was seen as an intrusion of privacy. So what you what you see as private or not being private can change over time in relation to use of technologies. So this articulation and discussion has to go on.
We got about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to try to ask you 2 questions. So let's see how we go.
Okay.
For business leaders or entrepreneurs listening to this conversation, what kind of initiative changes, policies should they be watching out for that might happen within the next couple of years, 2 to 3 years?
Well, there it really matters whether it's what is the size of these companies. I think this really matters quite a lot. So I think the bigger multinational operations, some are of course quite well aware of this, to have a long-term view on their organization in relation to the big societal challenges we have, from climate change, energy, and so on. Firstly, all big companies have to engage in this anticipation process. I give you one example, which was an interview with a chemical plant in the Netherlands, which is also a multinational, DSM, which has a program on research for what they call the 3P. So it's people, planet, profits, but but that reflects a little bit such an anticipation. One can say whether they do it well or not. One can argue about it, but I mean it's an attempt. So one has to take this seriously, and some other companies do try to do things along those lines in terms of longer term anticipation. So that's for the bigger companies, and there also the direct involvement. So this is of course maybe part of deliberate democracy, to have interfaces with citizens as well. Not just whether they would swallow particular products, but also in terms of what products they actually will demand for the longer term. So I think that's for the bigger companies, and I think we have to, if public governance really gets on track in terms of the state implementing innovation standards, for example, to which companies can comply to, then they would also be the first to adopt those, rather than the smaller companies who have not the capacity to do all these things. Well, it's a well-known fact that even to small, medium-sized companies, investment, for example, in research or in longer-term projects is difficult for them to do within an economic rationale in which they have to operate. That's a challenge. I think for the smaller companies, I think it will be important, which we highlighted before, to look out not only for other companies with which they have to compete, but also with whom they can collaborate. So engaging in networks around innovation topics which actually address these societal challenges as well. And they're interesting. We know when it comes to innovations, they come earlier from the smaller companies than from the bigger ones. Again, COVID is a nice example. All the new vaccines, they came out of the context of startups. So we have Pfizer with the German biotech, of course, publicly subsidized to do so. We have AstraZeneca with Oxford University. So we have Johnson with the Dutch firm Johnson, which was also a startup. So you have the small companies who are most innovative, but can only bring these innovations to the market with the help of the bigger ones, or engaging with other smaller ones and make joint initiatives. And maybe this latter is something which is less practiced nowadays. It's now still more a matter of okay, waiting till a small firm is successful and then hoping that you will be bought up on or something. So and I think this model on the long term is not driving innovation. It may actually kill it. So that's I think the major things I would think of at the moment.
So to close off this interview, last question, and it's about your reflection. So thinking about your career, what's something you want to see happen during your career? If you, like one big thing, what would it be?
Okay. Well, I mean, yeah, I'm now currently so preoccupied with this change of the rewards and incentive system of science that I hope to see this happening very, very quickly and still, before I go in retirement. So. And then, of course, the bigger things on which we also talked about today, they are for the longer term. So probably I will not be alive anymore if they are going to happen or not. But of course, one has, it's a long process. So this is where I'm engaged in. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for the interview. It was a pleasure to have been able to talk to you.
It's really my honor. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
see you again.